Albert Camus' position on Algeria cannot be understood as a detached political argument. It was a personal and moral conflict rooted in the place where he was born. Algeria was not an abstract case study for Camus. It was the geography of his childhood, the poverty of his family, the sunlit streets of Algiers, and the fragile coexistence of people divided by law but bound together by daily life. Camus was born in 1913 into a poor European settler family. His father died in the First World War, and he was raised by his mother in near silence and poverty. This background mattered deeply to his thinking. Camus did not experience colonialism from a position of power, but neither did he experience it from the position of the colonized. He lived inside a divided society without fully belonging to either side. From early on, Camus was sharply critical of the colonial system. As a journalist in the 1930s, he documented famine, exploitation, and political exclusion suffered by Arab Algerians. He condemned the French administration for ignoring misery and treating injustice as an administrative inconvenience. Long before open war began, Camus warned that a society built on humiliation and inequality was unsustainable. On this point, Camus was unequivocal. Colonialism was unjust. But Camus also believed that injustice did not erase moral responsibility. Algeria, for him, was not a simple struggle between pure victims and pure oppressors. It was a shared human space where millions of people lived without having chosen the system governing them. Among them were poor settlers with no other homeland, and indigenous Algerians denied basic rights. Camus believed that solutions demanding indiscriminate killing or mass expulsion would replace one injustice with another. Liberation achieved through terror, he feared, would inherit the moral corruption of domination. This conviction would define his isolation. Camus refused to simplify Algeria into a moral slogan. He insisted on holding together two truths at once. Colonialism was wrong, and murder remained wrong, even when committed in the name of justice. As the political situation in Algeria deteriorated, Camus became increasingly convinced that the greatest danger was not only injustice itself, but the way injustice invited moral shortcuts. When suffering persists for decades without remedy, outrage hardens into desperation. Camus understood this process clearly. He did not deny the anger of the colonized or dismiss the rage produced by humiliation. But he believed that desperation does not confer moral permission. Camus argued that colonial authorities bore enormous responsibility for allowing injustice to fester. For decades, Algerians were denied political representation, economic opportunity, and legal equality. These were not minor grievances, they were structural features of colonial rule. Camus warned that ignoring them would lead to violence, not because violence was virtuous, but because it would appear to be the only remaining voice. Yet Camus refused to accept the claim that because reform failed, unlimited violence became legitimate. He believed this reasoning confused explanation with justification. To understand why people resort to violence is not to absolve them of responsibility for how they do so. Moral responsibility, Camus insisted, does not disappear under pressure. It becomes more urgent. This belief placed Camus at odds with revolutionary movements that treated violence as self-justifying. Many argued that colonial oppression made violent revolt inevitable and therefore morally sanctioned. Camus accepted the first claim, but rejected the second. Inevitability explains behavior. It does not cleanse it. Algeria revealed how quickly politics becomes fatalistic. Once people believe violence is inevitable, they stop resisting it morally. Killing becomes routine. Death becomes background noise. Camus believed this fatalism was one of the most dangerous ideas of modern politics. He insisted that even in tragedy, choice remains. That choice may be constrained, painful, and costly, but it never vanishes. To deny choice is to deny moral agency itself. Camus believed that the task of justice was not to justify violence after it occurs, but to resist the slide into moral numbness before it becomes complete. Algeria tested whether people truly believed in human dignity, or only believed in it when it required no sacrifice. For Camus, that test could not be passed by choosing a side. It could only be passed by refusing to abandon principles when sides demanded blood. As violence escalated in Algeria, Camus became increasingly alarmed by the collapse of moral boundaries. Acts that would once have been considered unthinkable were now discussed as strategic necessities. Bombings, executions, torture, and reprisals entered ordinary political language. Camus believed this normalization of cruelty was one of the most dangerous consequences of colonial conflict. He rejected the idea that history could justify such acts. History, Camus argued, records outcomes, not moral truth. To say that violence is justified because it leads to liberation is to confuse success with justice. A victorious future does not redeem present suffering. The dead do not benefit from historical necessity. Camus condemned revolutionary terrorism without hesitation. Bombs placed in cafes or public spaces did not strike colonial power structures. They struck bodies. They killed people who had no control over policy. For Camus, this was not resistance. It was terror, regardless of the cause invoked to justify it. At the same time, Camus condemned the French state's use of torture and collective punishment. Torture, he believed, destroyed the moral legitimacy of the state entirely. A government that tortures forfeits its claim to justice, even if it claims to be defending order or civilization. Camus applied the same moral standard to both sides because he believed principles must not bend to allegiance. Justice that excuses its own crimes is no longer justice. A cause that demands moral exemption has already corrupted itself. This position isolated Camus profoundly. He was accused of moral weakness, false equivalence, and betrayal. Camus rejected these accusations. Refusing to justify murder, he argued, was not neutrality. It was fidelity to the value of human life. Algeria forced Camus to confront one of the most painful truths of political violence. Injustice does not automatically confer righteousness. Suffering explains rage, but it does not sanctify cruelty. Once murder is justified, it spreads. Violence creates the conditions for further violence, each act feeding the next. Against this spiral, Camus insisted on limits. Moral boundaries exist precisely for moments of crisis. If they collapse under pressure, they were never real. Algeria showed Camus how fragile restraint becomes when fear and ideology take control. Camus believed that one of the most destructive effects of the Algerian conflict was the replacement of conscience with ideology. Once a political cause demands absolute loyalty, individual moral judgment begins to dissolve. People stop asking whether an action is right and begin asking only whether it serves the cause. For Camus, this shift marked the beginning of moral collapse. In Algeria, both sides appealed constantly to necessity. Revolutionary groups claimed violence was the only remaining path to dignity. The French state claimed repression was required to preserve order. Each side presented its actions as unavoidable. Camus rejected this framing entirely. He believed inevitability was often an excuse used to silence doubt and avoid responsibility. For Camus, moral responsibility never disappears. Even under extreme pressure, individuals remain accountable for what they do. To deny this is to deny human agency itself. A world in which no one is responsible is a world in which anything can happen. Camus was particularly disturbed by how ideology transformed suffering into abstraction. Victims became symbols. Deaths became numbers. Language softened brutality and disguised cruelty. Camus believed this abstraction made violence easier to commit and harder to resist. He insisted that justice must remain grounded in the concrete. A political theory that cannot face the suffering it produces is morally bankrupt. Algeria, he believed, showed how easily ideas become indifferent to bodies once history is allowed to override conscience. This refusal to surrender moral judgment made Camus deeply unpopular. He was accused of standing in the way of history itself. But Camus believed history without conscience was nothing more than organized brutality. Ideology offers comfort. It provides clarity in chaos and meaning in suffering. But Camus believed this comfort came at a terrible cost. When people believe their cause is absolute, they grant themselves permission to destroy others. Algeria forced Camus to insist on a difficult truth. Justice must be defended without guarantees. There is no historical destiny that will redeem cruelty. There is no future victory that can erase present suffering. For Camus, once conscience is surrendered, politics becomes indistinguishable from violence. Camus believed that colonial violence also reshaped how people understood justice itself. Under colonial rule, law was not experienced as protection but as control. Courts, police, and institutions existed, yet they served one population while restraining another. Over time, this taught entire communities to associate justice with punishment rather than fairness. Camus feared that this distortion would survive the end of colonial rule. When justice has been used as an instrument of domination, people stop trusting it as a moral ideal. They come to believe that power, not law, is what truly governs society. In such conditions, violence begins to feel more honest than institutions. This is why Camus believed that independence alone could not heal the damage of colonialism. Political sovereignty without moral reconstruction risked reproducing the same injustices under new leadership. Liberation that merely changed rulers would leave the deeper moral wounds untouched. Camus insisted that justice must be separated from vengeance. Colonial oppression created real grievances, but vengeance could not repair them. Punishing entire groups or celebrating retaliation would only deepen division. Justice, to be real, had to be restrained, individual, and accountable. He understood how unsatisfying this sounded to those who had suffered for decades. Anger demands expression. Grief demands recognition. Camus did not deny these demands, but he believed satisfying them through violence would guarantee further suffering. For Camus, the hardest moral task was not condemning injustice, but refusing to imitate it. Colonialism had already taught people how to dominate. Liberation had to unlearn that lesson, or it would fail. Algeria showed Camus how easily justice collapses when emotion replaces judgment. Moral clarity does not come from emotional release, it comes from restraint. The refusal to answer cruelty with cruelty is not weakness. It is an attempt to break a cycle that otherwise has no natural end. Camus believed that a society incapable of restraint would never be free, regardless of who governed it. Justice built on vengeance carries the seed of future oppression. Camus believed that fear was one of the most powerful forces shaping the Algerian conflict. Fear governed decisions, justified violence, and narrowed moral imagination. Once fear becomes normal, people stop asking what is just and begin asking only what will keep them alive. Camus believed this transformation was one of colonialism's most corrosive effects. In Algeria, fear existed on all sides. Algerians feared arrest, torture, and disappearance. European settlers feared attacks, retaliation, and expulsion. Each fear produced preemptive violence. Camus understood this psychology, but he refused to allow fear to become a moral authority. Fear explains behavior, he argued, but it does not justify cruelty. A society that allows fear to dictate ethics will eventually permit anything. Emergency measures become permanent. Repression becomes routine. Moral limits dissolve. Camus believed that justice must interrupt fear rather than obey it. This was not sentimental optimism. It was a recognition that fear-driven societies become incapable of restraint. Once fear rules, violence expands to meet imagined threats, not real ones. Algeria showed Camus how quickly temporary measures become normalized. Curfews, censorship, mass arrests, and torture were justified as necessary responses to crisis. But Camus believed that what is justified once becomes easier to justify again. A society that learns to live with repression does not easily unlearn it. This is why Camus insisted that moral limits must be defended during conflict, not postponed until peace. Waiting until violence ends is too late. The habits formed in war shape the society that follows. Camus knew that resisting fear would not end the war, but he believed surrendering to fear would end something worse, the possibility of justice. For Camus, courage was not the absence of fear. It was the refusal to let fear decide what is permitted. Algeria taught him that fear is understandable, but it cannot be sovereign. Camus believed that one of the most devastating consequences of the Algerian conflict was the collapse of shared imagination. Once violence became dominant, people stopped imagining a future together. Politics narrowed into survival. The question was no longer how different communities might live side by side, but how one could defeat or eliminate the other. This loss of imagination disturbed Camus deeply. He believed that violence does not only destroy lives, it destroys possibilities. It erases futures before they can be tested. In Algeria, ideas of coexistence were dismissed as naive or even treacherous, not because they had been disproven, but because violence had made them unthinkable. Camus refused to accept this narrowing of vision. He did not deny how difficult coexistence would have been. He denied that difficulty was the same as impossibility. Once war took over, complexity was replaced by force. Nuance vanished. Only victory or defeat remained. Camus believed that this collapse of imagination was one of violence's most enduring crimes. Even after war's end, societies shaped by conflict struggle to recover the capacity to imagine shared futures. Distrust hardens into identity. Fear becomes inherited. Violence leaves behind a moral architecture that shapes generations. He argued that moral courage sometimes requires defending possibilities that history is trying to erase. Speaking of coexistence during war appears unrealistic, but Camus believed abandoning imagination guaranteed a different failure, the failure to remain human. For Camus, Algeria showed that justice requires not only resistance to injustice, but resistance to despair. Violence thrives on despair. It convinces people that only force remains. Camus believed this was precisely when restraint mattered most. He did not claim that imagination would stop violence. He claimed that without it, violence would define the future entirely. Algeria taught Camus that realism without moral imagination becomes brutality. A future built without imagination is not realistic, it is merely violent. Camus believed that the Algerian conflict revealed how easily moral language collapses under pressure. Words like justice, freedom, and liberation were used constantly. Yet they increasingly meant whatever served the speaker's side. As violence escalated, these words stopped guiding action and began excusing it. This collapse of language deeply alarmed Camus. He believed that when words lose their moral content, cruelty becomes easier. If justice means victory, then injustice disappears by definition. If freedom means domination by the correct side, then oppression simply changes hands. In Algeria, Camus saw how both colonial authorities and revolutionary groups relied on euphemism. Torture was renamed interrogation. Civilian deaths were described as accidents or necessities. Terrorism was reframed as heroic resistance. Each linguistic shift made violence feel more distant and acceptable. Camus believed that violence requires this corruption of language. Killing cannot be sustained without justification, and justification depends on words that soften reality. Once people stop naming suffering honestly, they stop confronting it morally. This is why Camus insisted that clarity of speech was a form of resistance. To call torture torture, murder murder, and injustice injustice was not rhetorical purity, it was moral defense. Language for Camus was the last barrier between conscience and brutality. He knew that honest words would not stop the war, but he believed that without them, nothing humane could survive it. A society that lies about its violence cannot later build justice. It cannot heal what it refuses to name. Algeria taught Camus that moral decay often begins with small linguistic compromises. Once people accept distorted language, distorted actions follow naturally. The vocabulary of necessity prepares the ground for cruelty. Camus believed that restoring justice required restoring meaning to words. Without that restoration, political change would remain hollow no matter who ruled. Camus believed that the Algerian conflict exposed the danger of moral tribalism. Once people fully identify with a side, moral judgment is replaced by loyalty. Actions are no longer evaluated on their own terms, but through the lens of allegiance. Everything done by us is excused. Everything done by them is condemned absolutely. For Camus, this shift marked the final collapse of moral responsibility. In Algeria, political camps demanded total loyalty. Silence was interpreted as betrayal. Nuance was treated as weakness. Camus refused this logic. He believed that justice requires distance from one's own side, not blind devotion to it. This refusal made Camus deeply unpopular. Both colonial authorities and revolutionary movements demanded allegiance without conditions. Camus offered something different. Conditional support based on moral limits. He would support justice wherever it appeared and condemn violence wherever it occurred. For those who demanded purity, this was intolerable. Camus believed that true moral responsibility begins with the willingness to judge one's own side. Condemning the enemy is easy. Condemning crimes committed in one's own name is painful. Without this willingness, cruelty spreads unchecked. Algeria showed Camus how quickly moral asymmetry becomes moral collapse. When people excuse their own violence while condemning others, everyone feels justified and no one feels responsible. Violence multiplies because it appears righteous from every perspective. Camus insisted that responsibility cannot be outsourced to history, ideology, or collective identity. Every violent act belongs to someone. Every victim matters equally. These principles did not end the conflict, but Camus believed abandoning them guaranteed catastrophe. He understood the psychological comfort of belonging to a camp. In times of fear, camps offer certainty and protection, but Camus believed certainty was the enemy of justice. It closed the space where conscience operates. Algeria taught Camus that independence of judgment is one of the hardest moral positions to hold. To judge actions rather than identities is to risk isolation. But for Camus, solitude was preferable to complicity. Camus believed that one of the deepest tragedies of Algeria was the way violence trained people to live without limits. Once limits are crossed repeatedly, they stop appearing meaningful. What once shocked becomes normal. What once demanded justification becomes routine. For Camus, this erosion of limits was more dangerous than any single act of violence. Colonial repression crossed limits through torture, collective punishment, and arbitrary detention. Revolutionary violence crossed limits through attacks on civilians and deliberate terror. Each side claimed the other left no alternative. Camus rejected this reasoning absolutely. Limits, he argued, exist precisely for moments of crisis. A moral principle that collapses under pressure was never a principle at all. He believed that refusing to kill innocents was not naive idealism, but the last defense of humanity. Once that refusal disappears, nothing remains to restrain cruelty. Violence no longer shocks, it organizes. Camus knew that limits would not stop the war, but he believed they could prevent total moral collapse. Algeria, in his view, was not only a political tragedy, but a moral one because limits were abandoned on all sides. He warned that victories achieved without limits leave behind societies incapable of justice. A people trained to excuse cruelty will continue to excuse it long after the original cause has faded. Violence leaves habits behind. Camus also feared that once limits are abandoned, responsibility dissolves. People begin to speak in the passive voice. Atrocities happen. Deaths become regrettable outcomes. No one claims ownership. Camus insisted that every violent act has an author, and that authorship carries moral weight. Algeria taught Camus that the future is shaped not only by who wins, but by what is permitted along the way. Political success cannot redeem moral bankruptcy. A society that sacrifices limits for victory inherits the violence it normalized. For Camus, defending limits was not a strategy, it was a refusal to let cruelty define what is possible. Camus believed that Algeria revealed the tragic cost of choosing ideology over humanity. Political causes promise meaning, direction, and historical purpose, especially in times of suffering. But Camus believed that when ideology becomes absolute, it demands human sacrifice. People become instruments rather than ends. Suffering is tolerated as necessary. Death is reframed as progress. Algeria showed Camus how easily ideology overrides compassion. Colonial authorities justified repression in the name of order and civilization. Revolutionary movements justified terror in the name of liberation and dignity. Each side believed history was on its side. Each believed its violence would be redeemed by future outcomes. Camus rejected this belief entirely. He argued that history does not redeem suffering. History records events. It does not judge them morally. To appeal to history is to evade responsibility in the present. For Camus, justice must remain anchored in lived human experience. A political theory that cannot face the suffering it produces is already corrupt. Algeria taught him that ideas become dangerous when they detach from bodies. This conviction led Camus to defend what he called measured rebellion. Rebellion that refuses murder, refuses terror, and refuses to justify cruelty, even under extreme injustice. This form of rebellion offers no guarantees of success. It may fail politically. But Camus believed it preserved something more important than victory: human dignity. He knew this position would not satisfy those demanding decisive action. It offered no heroic narrative, no clear enemy, no triumphant ending. But Camus believed that moral seriousness rarely looks heroic. Algeria forced Camus to accept a painful truth. Refusing to kill may mean losing, but killing in order to win destroys what victory is supposed to protect. For Camus, a cause that demands the sacrifice of innocence has already betrayed itself. Justice that requires cruelty ceases to be justice, regardless of its goals. In the end, Algeria remained an open wound for Camus. He did not live to see its independence, and even if he had, he would not have claimed vindication. Algeria was never about being proven right. It was about refusing to abandon humanity in the face of unbearable pressure. Camus believed that modern politics repeatedly places people before false choices: injustice or murder, domination or terror, silence or complicity. Algeria forced him to confront this dilemma directly. His refusal to choose between these options was not evasion. It was resistance to the logic that made them seem inevitable. He understood that his position would isolate him. It already had. But Camus believed solitude was preferable to moral surrender. To stand alone was better than to stand with cruelty. Algeria taught Camus that justice is fragile. It does not announce itself with certainty. It survives only through restraint, clarity, and refusal. It must be defended without guarantees and without illusions. He did not believe moral integrity would change the course of history. He believed it was necessary to remain human within it. A world that abandons dignity entirely becomes uninhabitable, regardless of who governs it. Camus' Algeria reminds us that the hardest moral positions are rarely the most popular. They offer no victory, no absolution, and no final resolution. They demand endurance rather than triumph. Yet Camus believed that endurance mattered. In a world increasingly willing to justify cruelty in the name of necessity, the refusal to kill remains a radical act. Algeria was not Camus' failure, it was his limit, and in refusing to cross that limit, Camus showed what it means to defend justice without illusions.